happy International Women's Day and welcome to our first Space&Co Comm.unity virtual event for 2022. My name is Shey Hooper and I am the National Director for Flexible Workspace Solutions at GPT and a proud member of Team Space&Co. Our Comm.unity events are designed to bring the Space&Co membership together, provide inspiration and tools to help you in your professional and your personal lives. So to begin our International Women's Day discussion, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we are recording this event today and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of New South Wales. We acknowledge and pay respect to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Today, I'm coming to you from Sydney's soggy northern beaches, which is Guringai country, the land of the Gadigal people. And I also acknowledge the traditional custodians on the various lands on which you are all working today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining in this virtual event. And I encourage you to share what country you're on through the chat function. We love to see. So today is International Women's Day. In fact, it's the 94th International Women's Day that since they began in 1928, which means we're here to celebrate women. We're going to break down bias and we're going to encourage a really open and frank discussion about how we can all make a difference in the workplace. I'm joined by two lovely, talented, intelligent ladies. So I'm going to have the honour of introducing them both now. So Kate joins me, Kate Mills, who is a highly experienced business journalist, thought leader, innovator and speaker. Kate is CEO of the Property Industry Foundation, an industry-wide collaboration across the property and construction industry, who increased the number of bedrooms for available for youth homelessness. Kate is ex-editor of the Business Review Weekly and CFO magazine, and established the professionalmums.net, an online platform for women looking to re-enter the workforce. So welcome, Kate. We're so pleased to have you as one of our panellists today.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. And our second panellist is Anastasia Clarke. Anastasia is CFO at the GPT Group and a member of Chief Executive Women. Named one of Asia's 25 most influential women in finance and treasury in 2015. Anastasia has over 25 years experience in the real estate industry. Anastasia was previously on the board of directors of the Property Council of Australia and is past president of the International and Capital Markets Division Council. So please welcome Anastasia.
Thank you, Shey.
And before we jump into our discussion, a reminder that we really love questions from our live audience. So please don't be shy and post these into the chat function so we can bring them into our conversation. All right, so Anastasia and Kate, we are going to weave our way through lots of different topics over the next 50 minutes or so. So let's dive on in and get started. We're going to start by looking, first of all, at flexibility and diversity and the importance of these things. So we hear about flexibility and diversity all the time. I know that we've talked about these things for a long time. And we have to reflect on the last couple of years with COVID, which seems to have accelerated flexibility and discussions about flexibility to all new heights. So perhaps, Kate, if we start with yourself, why are these things important? Why do we talk about them? And are they the answer to redressing the gender balance across corporate Australia?
So for me, the main reason why we talk about them is actually, it's just a reason of equity. You know, we want an equitable world where women and men have an equal opportunities and equal access to opportunities. And so because of the gender division and how we have divided up roles, particularly around caring roles, you know, it makes it more difficult for women to be able to access those opportunities in the employment market or in other places if they're not able to get that certain amount of flexibility. And I'd say the same is fair for men too. Look, I think men get boxed into gender roles and gender responsibilities, and so do women. And I think flexibility is of equal advantage to both genders. Look, I think we're at this moment where, there's a lot of talk around the Great Reset. We've had these very unexpected last 2 years, which has completely changed behaviour, how we work, how we are at home, how we are with families, etc. And flexibility has been the key thing to it. It was really interesting when the pandemic first started, because I'd worked for quite a period of time with organisations trying to help them being more flexible. And I'd worked particularly in professions where flexibility is a bit of an issue, which generally is law and accounting, slightly more conservative professions. And I would go into organisations there and talk about flexibility, and they'd make minuscule little movements towards it. It was impossible, they said, for there to be flexibility. 5 days after the pandemic, it was not impossible. Everyone was working from home. So just bear that in mind. The impossible is actually always possible. So that's great. And now we're ideally, hopefully, coming towards the new normal, and there's going to be a little bit more stability just generally in the market and in our lives. And I think this is a really interesting point for us all, for leaders and for people working, to think about what flexibility will look like in the next 2 years, what that reset will look like. You asked there the question, is it the silver bullet? Look, I think flexibility is absolutely key to diversity and to equity and to getting more women into the workplace. I don't think it is necessarily the silver bullet, though. I think what we'll find is that flexibility moves things forward, as things have been progressing, but we'll find there are other more invisible factors at work that still work against having equal participation in the workforce. So that's my view. What about you, Anastasia?
I think you're right. There's a lot of structural systemic issues, but I do think it can be a silver bullet. And I really think it's such a unique opportunity of such a severe acceleration of flexible working that it can be our one lever of enablement of both men and women sharing equality and sharing family caring and everything in their lives, whether it be their career prospects or how they balance their lives and bring their whole self to work and their whole self to home. So I think that as leaders and as a society and workplace participants, we need to lean into it to actually really allow both men and women to prosper in that equality sharing, as opposed to falling into traps where, for example, it might be still that same society thing where women are the ones that don't return as quickly to the office because they've got the lion's share of primary caring, and the men are back in the office quicker and they're getting more notice, and there's confirmation bias, and maybe that leads to just the sheer proximity of them being in the office and being noticed is promotion. And I think that is a real danger, and we need to actively work that everybody is flexible.
Yes, I do think that with the change that came upon us, just like you said, Kate, almost overnight, where we've said we can't do it, and then bang, well, everyone did it across the world. It would seem to me a shame not to try and leverage that and to try and ensure that we are not reverting back. And I think there is I see evidence of embracing the change that's come about and sort of the levelling of the playing field and that shared experience across the organisation of remote working and working from home. But then there also is this tsunami that could come to just take us back to where we were. How do we, as women in leadership positions, how do you influence the conversation that you're hearing to ensure that doesn't happen?
You go, Kate.
I'll take that one. So thank you, Shey. And look, I chime off what Anastasia said, which is this is an opportunity. It is something that we should lean into. You shouldn't automatically think that things will naturally revert back into the mean, although that potential is there. So we do need to lean into it. And I think for me, some of it is around sort of transparency of conversation. I think what's really come up in the last 2 years is an understanding from employers that everybody's situation is actually quite unique and different. And I think the pandemic really showed that up, in terms of what your home situation was like, what vulnerable people you've got in the background, why you might not be able to come in on Tuesday, for a particular reason. So I think it's about elevating those conversations and the transparency of them right up there, and allowing employees, work participants to be able to come in and feel like they can have really open conversations about how they see work progressing for them. So there's that part. And I think on the other part, it is incumbent on organizations to lead the way, I think in a couple of different ways. So one is policies. I mean, it sounds simple, but Particularly when I've worked with smaller businesses, not necessarily larger businesses, who tend to have the resources to put into policies, but in that smaller business sector, where there's not the same amount of resources, just helping those businesses to realize there are easy places to go to where you can kind of essentially download all the policies that you should have in place to have an equitable workforce. So that's kind of one thing that organizations should think about doing. I think modeling, I think you can't get away from it. And Anastasia mentioned it, talking about who comes back to work first and what kind of behavior gets rewarded. One of the reasons why I'm less keen on seeing flexibility as a silver bullet is I think there's a host of other changes that need to happen around that. And most of those changes, to be honest with you, are cultural. You can have all the policies you want in place, but if you're not backing that up with cultural change, and if organizations leaders aren't walking the talk effectively and demonstrating to everybody what this new world of work could look like, then I think that it stymies it a little bit. So I think policies, I think modeling. And the other thing that I think organizations, and I think lots of great organizations do this, is also to embrace innovation in this area and be what I call progressive and generous. So, you see great innovation coming down the line around things like, blind candidates, you know what I mean? Not looking at people's CVs before you give them the job. So encourage, which is quite different to how organizations would traditionally have recruited. So encouraging organizations to be across that kind of innovation and to play with it. You might not do everything at once, but you can probably do one or two little things and trial them and see how they look. And I also put together those two ideas of being both progressive and generous. So progressive and generous means that, yes, all the policies are there. Can you do a little bit more than that? And I tell people this story from my history as to why I say progressive and generous. So when I was a journalist at Fairfax, and I'm going to name them because I didn't like this behaviour. They don't really exist anymore anyway, so I can. I went on maternity leave, and they offered, 10 weeks salary on top of what the government offered. They would not pay super on that 10-week salary. Yeah, and I went to talk to them, and I said to them, this is mean. It's 10 weeks salary. Why aren't you paying super on top of that? And so, and they do now, and lots of organisations do now, and that behaviour has shifted. But it's that idea within organisations of the thought of being generous as well. What's that extra little thing I can do that's going to make it easier for women to leave work and to come back to work. I wouldn't hog the mic, but I'll give one more quick example because it's a positive one from my time at Fairfax. So when I came back to work, I came back at 6 months. As I say to people, I had the kind of baby that sent you back to work. So that was good. So after 6 months, I called my boss and said, I could come back for one day a week, because I knew, as everyone does, that there were projects happening that I could work on one day a week. And my boss at that time said, that would be great. And we'll pay you for 2 days a week, because if you're working one day a week, you'll be doing another day on top. So it's that sort of generosity of thinking, generosity of culture that I think sends a message to women that, you're welcome back in the workforce. We're going to reward the effort that you're making to come back to work.
Yeah, impressive. Anastasia, did you have any reflections on that, or particularly something Kate said earlier about the role modelling of behaviour at a senior level? What have you observed since the coming sort of back to the office and out of COVID?
Oh, well, it's been a staggered start back into sort of shadow lockdowns with Omicron and things, which is a real shame. And then Sydney's weather is so bad last week and this week, I feel like it hasn't really got its run on yet. What I would say is there are some overt teams that are more younger, less caring or parenting responsibilities, and that could be a big assumption on my part. But when you sort of observe them, you think that, and they're in. And then you've got other teams that are much more flexible, and some where men and women are much more flexible together. So it is a bit of a hybrid. I think leaders, first of all, I would say I think people should have freedom of choice. I think they should work from where they feel they are most productive. I think they should choose how that is works for them and for their business and for their team. And they need to be really conscious about that, particularly the business and the team as well. But I think leaders have to put themselves into another category. And I think that means that you're in a privileged position and you are a role model, whether you like it or not. And any senior person, people manager, you are setting an example. And I think that demonstrating flexibility is extremely important. It's almost an onus then on you to do so, because that takes the fear out of what the policy might say versus what do people see and observe in the behaviours of the people around them. And I think policy is one thing you really need to walk the talk.
Yeah, really good reflection, Anastasia. So if I'm sort of gathering takeaways for us as we go through, so the policies, and particularly being able to, as a smaller business, find your way to policies to give you some guidance, like you said, Kate, but then looking at, well, how can we be generous? So how can we go have that as a baseline and go a bit beyond? And then your reflection, Anastasia, is how are those policies interpreted, and how do senior leaders role model or not certain behaviours that they want people to feel comfortable to follow?
Yeah, exactly. And if I can add to Kate's point on the generosity, I think corporate Australia generally has become much more generous, like you said. They pay super on parental leave, etc. now. In fact, they have parental leave policies. They don't have maternity leave policies. And they have, at GPT, we certainly have equal parental leave payments that are very generous, well above government specified levels. I don't know, it must be at least more than double. But it is for men and women. And it includes things like super. And then there's childcare subsidies on top, because of course that's not enough of a childcare subsidy from government. So there's lots of generosity in this space. The one thing I feel that we had to really push ourselves on in the more recent few years is to actually allow flexibility to men and women on how they take parental leave. Because if that's part also of a hybrid solution, Kate mentioned 1 day a week, if you can stagger your return to work, and that helps with the entire, getting your access to childcare, which sometimes has to start small and step up, then that's what we have to be innovative about, not set rules that are too rigid.
And if I just to add to that, I was just thinking as you were talking, Anastasia, and I absolutely agree with you. I mean, I told that story, that was years ago. My children are practically grown up, but corporate Australia and all organisations, I think, have become much more generous about it. And I think some of the thinking behind that generosity has to think about, you must resource policies. This is the issue between putting policies out there and not resourcing them. And I'll sort of tell a little story. So I used to run an organisation called professionalmums.net, which is about getting mums back into the workforce, and I built a database of mums highly skilled mums, lawyers, accountants looking to get back into work, and I sold access to that database to large organisations. Now, large organisations at the top loved that database. You know what I mean? It was an easy sell, we're going to get it. But when you went into the recruitment team, it was like another thing that they had to do. So it was kind of like, well, that's great, but I've got 6 databases I'm already using. Now I've got a 7th database, and it always brought home to me, in the end, yeah, policies are great. You have to be able to resource them, and you have to be able to give managers enough resources to be able to deliver those policies, and to be able to be generous in terms of how people live their lives, and particularly in that sort of transition period around parenthood, where things can get really knotty.
Yeah, that actually is a really good case in point, because that's what I've observed in my years at GPT. We had flexibility actually in the entire 12 years I've been at GPT. Now it's taken on a new course as a result of the pandemic, like it has accelerated for all. But things like, for example, we had a diversity and inclusion working group, and we've had some unconscious bias training, but a lot of that has moved on enormously. And to your point on resources, Kate, we now have a head of diversity inclusion, an expert, led by Justine Knight at GPT, who gets us the right bias training. It's thinking bias as well as what you visually see bias and assumptions, and setting strategies around unpacking that and making sure we're very real about the levers we can pull on diversity inclusion.
We've had a couple of questions come through to the audience, so I might share those and see if you've got some reflections. And then I think it's a great segue to move into talk a little bit more about bias and the theme today, which is, of course, about breaking the bias. So one of the questions has come through from one of our male members of the audience, and he says, I've been grateful for the flexibility that COVID has brought, but there is a growing expectation now that things should go back to the way they were. How do I speak up about what I want and the new work arrangements that are best for my family?
I can give that a go. Yeah. I think keep doing exactly what you were doing. And I think, it may not please everybody. And particularly GPT as an example, we're in the office business. We want people in the CBDs. We want thriving CBDs and use of our office buildings. But there is no investor or tenant that we talk to in the corporate space that is saying just because of hybrid working, they're necessarily shrinking their space. The very large employers are, but they're not the main users or only users of office space. And lots of employers are embracing the fact that they accept that there'll be a level of midweek potential hump of those coming in so that everyone can work together on those days. So I think you should embrace exactly what your needs are. You should be transparent about them, to Kate's point earlier. But equally, if you have a level of fear about that transparency, then make sure you're only sharing the part that you think needs to be shared, so you don't feel judged. And I reach out to everyone to say, don't make assumptions and don't judge people, because there are not just women that are trying to balance the early childhood stage of just so much pressure on progressing your career and staying in the workforce as well as having a family. That pressure is on men, and younger men are a whole different generation in terms of the society expectation of them to share parenting, to be a good dad, to be serious about their career, and they don't get the blessing from society or within and amongst their employer the same as a woman gets the understanding. Of course, you've got these child primary caring responsibilities, and we have to appreciate that, because they're our future leaders, as are the young women in our corporate Australia are our future leaders, and we just want equality, and that's the best way to get it, is to not go back on what we've achieved in a very rapid time frame.
So Anastasia has given a fantastic and really complete answer, so there's not much I can add apart from, and it mirrors what Anastasia said, which is in the end, it is conversation and culture. So you have to keep having the conversations, even though they can be difficult, and you can feel uncomfortable with them. There's a level of trying to find out who can you have that conversation with and what does it look like. And also just to remember that what we're trying to achieve in the end is actually cultural change, and cultural change happens when we change it. Cultural change doesn't come from above. Cultural change comes from within. So you've got to position yourself as a warrior at every conversation of cultural change.
Yeah. And for leadership, it actually can be really exciting. So there's the fear factor of, what if I don't have my employment base here and in and around me, and what if they're not really working, and those sorts of things, which largely have been overcome because it's been dispelled quite quickly because it's been so long during the pandemic. The exciting opportunity is if we can get equal participation between men and women in the workforce. That is an entire talent pool that we are not accessing today, and all employers are suffering a shortage of talent. It's only going to get worse. Immigration will need to take the place again, but it isn't there yet. And maybe it won't come back in the same way that it did prior to the pandemic. So it's an exciting opportunity for us to use this flexibility policy and really live it in order to attract new talent to our organisation.
And there's one more question that comes through that really plays on that nicely, Anastasia, as a lead on from that. So flexibility, I hear what you're saying, flexibility is sort of an enabler of us getting the diversity outcomes that we're striving for. And then the question is, I feel that we're getting better at diversity, but its inclusion and having that equality of voice is still a struggle. So even if we've got a diverse group of people around the table, are we not necessarily hearing their voices equally? And what can we do about that?
Yeah, I think we have to be very purposeful about that, and none of us are perfect, and it takes practice and discipline. And myself, I'm more of a natural talking extroverted type of person, and for all the introverts, that really is it can suck their energy, and will cause them even further to not speak up. Let's say you're all sitting at a table and you're having a meeting, and I think that it means that all of us together, but particularly the leader, have to be very aware to try and structure conversations to ensure everyone has equal voice at the table, and thinking about the introverts and giving them a heads up. I'm going to ask you, even ahead of time in the meeting, I'd like you to talk to this particular thing, so that they can get comfortable and know they'll be called upon. And maybe start with someone who's a little bit more confident, icebreaker, and then go to all your ones that are less inclined to speak up because they don't feel they're given that platform. So it takes some active management.
Yeah, sure does.
Yeah, and I'd agree with that. As in, you're trying to change behaviour, and we're generally brought up to think he or she who speaks loudest is best. It's quite an ingrained behaviour within us. There's a fantastic article. It's a piece of research that Google did. The article's in the New York Times. It's a few years old now, but Google being Google and having lots of resources, they've got things like workplace psychologists, to figure out how to make people work better. And this psychologist took on looking at all the teams in Google to find out what was the one thing that high-performing teams had in common. And it was a 2-year piece of research, and she looked at, did they hang out together outside of work? What was the mix of them? And the end result of the research was that the one thing that all high-performing teams had in common was equal share of voice in meetings, and that, she would go in, she would actually watch people at meetings, and she would go in and see that where there was equal share of voice, that was the thing that you could tie directly to high performance. And I mean, I love that piece of research. I share it with every team I work with, actually, so they can see it. So that you can make people understand, particularly leaders, there is a business benefit to putting in that time and active management. Your team will perform better. And I do agree with Anastasia, you almost have to structure conversations as a leader. You can't just, sit back and hope that it will happen. You really have to put some thought into it. We do a meeting once a week where I make everyone speak, basically. That's it. Everyone's got to say something in that meeting.
And I think what I would add to what you're both saying, a reflection of my own is, and this is hard, it's like what you said, Anastasia, you've got to be purposeful, and it's difficult. It's why being a leader and a manager of people, it's a tough job, but creating that psychologically safe space for people to be able to bring their voice. So, yeah. All right, we might move on to having a bit more of a talk around bias. And obviously the theme for International Women's Day this year is to break the bias. So the International Women's Day organisation has released some research aligned with today's celebration, which states that 73% of women experience bias at work. Yet less than a third of employees can actually recognise bias when they see it, which I think is one of the inherently difficult things about bias, is that we all hold them, we all carry them through, and we can be very blind to them. Even well-intended people can be very blind to our bias. So it's a hard one for us to break down, but I think we're going to have a go and see how we can pull this one apart for the people who are listening. And we know that whether it's deliberate or unconscious, bias can make it hard for women to get hired, to be promoted. It can negatively impact their day-to-day work experience. So we've got to continue to try to chip away with it. So maybe to start with, perhaps Anastasia, if you've got any reflections, what do you think workplace bias actually looks like? How do we identify it, or are there ways to identify it? Which I know is a tough question.
I'm surprised by that statistic on less than a third see it or recognise it. I touched base with a bunch of women leading up to this event, and I asked them for examples of have they felt bias, and have they got any examples? And there was a lot.
Oh, cool.
And there was a lot of overt. So I think that perhaps surprises people and think it's more subtle. I think there is both. But, down to the simplest example where one said, we lost someone in a woman in our development management role in our team. She had advanced her career, was reasonably senior, has come with a notebook, well prepared, considered for the purposes of the meeting. Her male colleagues at the meeting didn't have their notebook and said, can you do the note taking? And just assumed from there on she was the note taker of the meeting, and certainly wasn't the most junior person in the team. Not that it necessarily needs to be allocated to the junior person either. So there are, some overt biases, and my understanding is that was one of the real reasons why that person, left that team. I think that there is the flip side of that, and I have seen this where, and it was played back to me, where men come to the meeting, as an example. This is more subtle bias, with no notebook, but also lean back in the chair like this and have the hands like this, and it's just such a power play stance of superiority and intimidation type stance. And I think people need to be really aware of that kind of positioning they're putting themselves in, because it's so old-fashioned. And most people look at it and go, aren't you like, they don't actually think you're powerful, I'm not. So, and any person who is intimidated by that, I think you should park it into that's a small man syndrome act. I think there is other biases that are perhaps more assumption-based. subtle. I know in my own example, I had a very senior manager, and I was reasonably senior myself, where they played back to me, I didn't think you were ambitious. I didn't, you've got young children. I didn't think you'd want to grow your career at this time. And this was when I was asking for a promotion. I was infuriated, absolutely infuriated. But I'm the kind of person that can push through that, and I have a fair level of resilience. Well, for other people, that can be soul destroying. It was reasonably soul destroying for me, but I made sure I pushed through it. And I think that is a very, very dangerous assumption. Just because you're at that point in your life where you've got this additional pressure does not mean in any shape or form you're not leaning into your career or your career growth, or that you lack ambition. Same goes for these men I was talking about earlier around, they've got these full expectations on the home front as well as their career. And if they're not seen in the office, the worst assumption or dangerous assumption you could make is they're not serious about their career. It's the wrong way to go.
Kate, have you seen bias play out around you through your career that you could share any reflections of?
Yeah, I think, I agree with what Anastasia was saying about the statistics, and similar conversations I've had with women around, and they all, are able to point to an incident that either happened to them or an incident that they witnessed. Look, I think about bias, in a couple of different ways. You've got conscious bias, unconscious bias. You've also got what I call structural bias. And so the example I give there, so, I worked in journalism for about 15 years. And in journalism, particularly business journalism, there is a lot of informal networking at 5 o'clock in the pub. Yeah, that's just the way it works. You've been working, you can go 5 o'clock, you can go to the pub. But when you're a mother with caring duties, you can't go to the pub at 5 o'clock. You can't access any of that informal networking. So and look, some of that as an individual, you have to take responsibility for. You've got to kind of think, okay, I'm going to set something up next Tuesday when I know I can, I'm going to be late. But some of that, the organization also has to facilitate as well, and sort of take on. Just using networking as an example, we're going to have an internal networking event at 4 o'clock, for example, because we know that's going to make it easier for people. So that kind of structural bias. The bias I probably think is the most heinous, if you like, is the unseen bias. It's what I call the doors that are not open to you because you can't even see the door. So in one of my very first jobs, I was working in London for a small publisher, and I was working as a researcher. They put an advert out for another researcher. They've got this many applications, paper CVs, because that's how old I am. And my boss came in and threw the paper CVs down in front of me and said, sort them into Oxbridge, as in Oxford, Cambridge, and non-Oxbridge. And I'll look at the Oxbridge ones. Now, I didn't come from Oxbridge, so it would never have occurred to me that, an employer would look at it like that. And you start to see there's the doors that you can't even see that will never open to you. And I think those, in some ways, they're the hardest ones. They're almost like the unknown unknowns, if you know what I mean. You don't know that they're there, and it's difficult to know what to do about them. But I think, I think for women and for us as a society, and certainly this is certainly what I hear from friends of mine, is that the danger is that bias goes from being overt to being hidden, and people get better at overt action effectively because they know, like you're saying, you can't sit like this, and that's good. But just watching where that bias shifts to and how that bias manifests in ways that become very difficult to point out because you can't actually see it.
So then we've had the likes of unconscious bias training around for some time now, and you reflected on it earlier, Anastasia, and you've said it was almost reframing and getting the right training. So can you expand on that more? Like, we've been doing this for a while. Is it actually having any success in breaking and trying to help us dismantle the bias?
I think as a general rule, it raises people's self-awareness, definitely, about themselves, but about others, and about how interactions can have unintended consequences, but also could have very positive consequences if they were that little bit more purposeful and aware. I think you need endless bias training. And all I was really saying is it's evolved in terms of, the way you think, in cohorts and things, as opposed to how you look or what ethnicity you are or what gender you are. But you need a constant reminder about it because we are humans and we all have innate biases right from when, we're nurtured as young children.
I can see from some of the questions in the chat are coming in from the audience, and there's a few specific questions which I will ask, but there's definitely an interest about where have you called it out? Like, have you had success or failures where you've tried to call it out? And equally, experiences you've had to recognize your own bias, because we've all got that too. So how have you tried to, I guess, think about your own assumptions and how you dismantled that for yourself, as much as trying to play a bigger role in calling out other behaviours? Do either of yourselves have a story or prepared to share a reflection in that regard?
Look, I'll kick off. I mean, I agree with Anastasia, which is, bias is exactly that. It's kind of built into you, and there's some research that shows unconscious bias doesn't shift bias; it just makes you aware of bias, which you might see as a first step. But that shifting bias is it's fundamentally quite difficult. I think the only thing you can do is constantly hold a mirror up. I mean, of course I have bias, and I agree with what, again, I sound like I'm agreeing with Anastasia a lot. I am, but, just because, I have my own perceptions about who might be ambitious, and who might not be ambitious, and they come from bias effectively. How do I, as a leader, make sure that I'm always asking the question, that I'm not bringing an assumption in, that I'm, that I'm being really clear and transparent and saying, well, tell me what you want, tell me how you think your career is going to play out is the answer. I think it goes back to the earlier conversation. There is no silver bullet in this area. It's not like one thing is going to change how we have always behaved, for all the time we've been humans. It's about a whole series of actions and constantly looking to make sure that you're moving from action to action. Do you have the policies in place? Are you being progressive? Are you having unconscious bias training? Are all of these things happening to try and move the dial?
I've got an example, Shey. Same as Kate, I have loads of bias and I need to hold up the mirror, but I think I love that, Kate. Ask questions and listen, because that is your best option to try and overcome it. I have an example, though, when we at GPT went from a maternity leave policy to a parental leave policy, and that included obviously giving the same benefits to men, and extending the period of time from 12 months to 2 years to allow both men and women to access that parental leave policy and the significant paid leave. I think back then it was something like 17 weeks. And the proposition was that the male taking parental leave didn't necessarily have to be primary carer. And I thought that was ingraining a bias that it is a woman's role to be primary carer that really innately I couldn't sit with. And what I wanted was, and what we got was, no, both have to qualify as primary carer to access that level of parental leave, because it is about truly sharing that load and truly being the parent that is taking care of that home front and the child rearing, so that their partner can participate in the workforce.
So true. And Michelle actually in our audience shared a comment on that earlier. She said that the opening up of parental leave to dads as well as mums not only allows the dad to have time bonding with children, which once upon a time they didn't have that as accessible, so that's great, and equally it allows the mother to return to work, so you bring that skill set back into the workforce. And yes, I can remember that conversation, Anastasia, and I think it was an important call out. And then what also happened as an evolution of that, which I also thought was a great outcome, is that we were realizing that there was a restriction in the policy which said that whoever was the primary carer, be it the mum or the dad, that leave needed to be taken within the child's first year of their life. But that actually meant sometimes that the man couldn't do it because the mother was already planning to take the first year off, and wanted to be there for that time, and didn't want to compress that to then allow the father to come back. So it wasn't an easy option, as it turns out, but because we're all assuming guidelines say year one we must work within the guidelines, it was like, well, why can't we allow the father or the second primary carer to take the leave in the second year, which then just opened it up so much more for families to have more choice about the time they take off with their children, how they return to work. And I think it's made it really accessible. So, and it's an evolution as a company, right? You just dip your toe in, and then like what you said, Kate, as well, you dip your toe in and then you start to get better at it and you test these policies. Absolutely.
And you also build in diversity to that whole thinking process. You know, there's a whole issue around how things are designed for men rather than are designed for women, because you don't bring in enough female design thinking, if you like. I mean, I've seen organizations, and you're both sort of giving similar examples, where they make a decision that seems neutral, you know what I mean, and seems to make sense, but actually creates an adverse effect. So I worked in an organization once, a large organization, tough times, and so they put out a note to effectively say that anyone that went on maternity leave would not be replaced during this period. But of course I said, yeah, but what that means is no one will hire women who could possibly give birth during that period. I mean, that's the adverse impact, and that's not what they expect. That's not what they intended. They were just looking at ways to making it clear to people where they were going to save money. So, you know, how do you bring in a diverse enough council, if you like, when you're coming up with policies, so they can start to see, oh, well, actually, how this would play out for this person is like this, but it would play out differently for someone else.
A quick suggestion here from someone, a quick check that they do to kind of check their own bias, particularly if they feel that they're making an assumption about a female's behaviour, is that they imagine that person as a man, and if all of a sudden what they're doing is okay, then they know that they're bringing a bias into their thinking. And then another question that came through earlier, which is actually reflecting on something you said towards the beginning of our chat, Anastasia. You mentioned confirmation bias. The question is, they'd love to hear from yourself around your experience with confirmation bias. Do you remember when you made the comment about confirmation bias? Do you want to give more context to that? And
well, it's in the context to those who come back into the office more than those who embrace flexibility more fully based on whatever their needs are, and this freedom of choice concept that we want people to work as productively as they can and prosper in all aspects of their life. And so the very fact you're in the office, do you get noticed more? Do you get listened to more? Is there a proximity factor? Is there just confirmation bias that you're serious about your career and you get noticed more than others? And that's what I was really calling out. And also, particularly if you were that kind of person or a leader that's going to promote someone, came from that background, you know, be in the office, be seen by the bosses, talk to the bosses, and, you know, good things will happen for you. And that may have been your experience set. So it can be very dangerous. And we really want to make sure we're getting the right talent into the roles. And that has taken for a long time, tapping people on shoulders. And in many cases, it has been women that haven't put their hand up for promotions. And I'm really proud of GPT, actually, because it has had to be such a focus area, such a conscious focus area for the first time in a long time. And we've had goals set for many, many years, but we've got to 50% women and gender balance for our top quartile, right? So by pay, a quarter of GPT's top people, 50% are women, and that's a fantastic outcome. In all our other cohorts, of course, as an organisation, we're actually more than 50% women. So that's a great outcome. We don't have a pay gap on like-for-like roles. We do have a pay gap overall because not all roles are like-for-like. There's seniority from the CEO right down to the most junior. We've reduced that pay gap really considerably. So in the last few years, it's come down by approximately 10% to 20%, and we're not going to let up on that focus. That will be a continued reducing KPI that we will focus on. And what does it mean? It means we're hiring talent and women that can make sure that we're getting to that diverse balance. It's also promoting people from within ourselves to also achieve those outcomes, which is great. And last year we had a third of our parental leave was taken by men. That's fantastic. I think on the confirmation bias point, that is one of our danger areas. One of our danger areas is men, very ambitious men, not wanting to take parental leave in that complete fear of will it label them as not being serious about their career. And that is a real shame, because that would not happen to a woman just for the biological reason that they do have the baby. So I really want people managers with emerging leaders and men that are either senior already or not, really encouraging them to take parental leave. It's a gift in life in any event, just for that bonding with their family.
Yeah, indeed. Thanks, Anastasia. So we might move into our last topic to discuss. So we've made our way through diversity and flexibility. We've talked about bias and some suggestions about how we can continue as a work in progress to address it, to identify it, to continue to question ourselves. So I wanted to talk about actually getting the seat at the table. And how, with some of these systemic problems that are continuing, how do we ensure that we're encouraging the diversity and particularly for women to take a seat at the table? And maybe in saying why are we talking about this, it's probably worth acknowledging or asking both of you, do you see reluctance? Do you, in your conversations you're having with women in your peer set or through your organisation, do you think we need to continue to encourage them to step up and take on those big roles, or do you see a reluctance to do that?
So I'll kick off. I think that there is still a section where women can often effectively self-select out and then not be saved by the organisation. Motherhood's the obvious one, but there's also other areas where you see women at a pivotal point in their career, and it's that sort of junior to mid. It's not the senior level. It's a bit below that, where things can get quite pressured. Can get quite pressured financially. They can often get quite pressured at home. I think we often don't take into account the amount of pressure it can have when you've got a young family and both parents are working, and there can just be a decision that because things are too pressured at home, that one person's going to step back and that person will be the woman, and that can effectively derail a career. It doesn't have to, and I make that point really strongly. Like I think everyone should have flexibility of choice. I took a couple of years out to look after my children. It didn't stop my career. It doesn't have to, but it can effectively derail it. And I think it's incumbent on, there is always a level of individual responsibility in terms of looking after your career, but it is also incumbent on organisations, when they look at that point where women start to leave, to think about how they can keep them or get them back in. When you look at most professions, tech, law and accountancy as an example, there are more women than men at the bottom, and that's the way it's been for several years now. You just get more female graduates coming out, but that narrows drastically around the time women are 28 to 32. You will see that women just start, as I say, just jumping out of the profession effectively. So I think there is still an issue, and then the problem becomes for organizations that there's not enough senior women effectively, so it becomes really difficult to hit those targets. And I applaud GPT for all the things Anastasia was saying about measuring effectively, because I think measuring really helps. It's really difficult. It's really easy for the issue to hide if you're not constantly measuring and sort of saying to yourself, okay, at graduate level we're 50-50, but at this level for some reason we're 55-45, which means that by the time I get to my senior ranks, I'm simply not going to have enough women to put into those roles. So yeah, look, I think it's still a massive issue.
I think women are putting their hands up more, Shey. It's normalised more than it was before. But I think there is a whole cohort of people that look around them at senior roles, even peer roles in different divisions, and don't necessarily like what they see. And maybe it is a bit of the pandemic shining a light on life and balance and, long hours. What's it all for? The politics that comes with all of that. Is it worth it? And I think that's actually something we've got to be very mindful of, and perhaps why well-being has become such a thematic, a very, very strong thing for us to think about and achieve for our people, because we're on the precipice of not everyone is seeing good or what good looks like around them, and we're under more and more pressure to create that for lots of cohorts, so then they are aspirational to those roles.
Yeah, and can I sort of bounce off that? One of the things I think about is that in the context of this conversation, what people can struggle with is, I think the way success has been designed is the way it's been designed by successful men. I mean, just by dint of history, effectively. And I think what Anastasia is talking to is, where's the position for women to design what success looks like for them, and for us to acknowledge that is phenomenally successful, so I think there's a little bit of that's got to happen at the same time, because in the end, if you're asking, as Anastasia was saying, if you're asking a sort of new generation of women to make sacrifices that they think haven't worked out for some people, I'm not necessarily sure they will,
I have met a wonderful new cohort of women recently through my children going to school. So many new families have come into our life, and within all those different families, there's all different working arrangements between the parents. And if I reflect on the mothers in particular, some of whom are working full-time, part-time, some have stepped away from what I'm learning were all sorts of amazing careers in order to be more hands-on in this stage with their children. But it's an interesting point that we're at, because our children are at the point where they're at the latter years of primary school, and whilst they still need you a lot, there is more independence, and there is a growing conversation amongst the women about returning to work. And then women who have stepped away from their careers for could be now 10 years, really trying to figure out how to start again. I think particularly perhaps, Kate, with the work that you've done with your professionalmum.net, did you talk to a lot of women who were grappling with that same thing? How do I just pick my career back up that's now 10 years gone? Or, how do I dip my toe back into that world where I'm, leaving the house and going to some sort of job again?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I worked with a lot of women who, when I was working at Professional Mums, who, taken a career break for 4+ years, etc., who are looking at getting back in. And generally the things I would say to them is, everything has changed. So, I think if you've taken a really long break from the job market, and this is true for men and women as well, this is not a female thing, the job market will have changed. Yeah. So to think, if you're struggling because you think, I'm going to go back to doing what I was doing 10 years ago, I used to say that's not going to work. What you've got to think about is, what I want to be doing now, and where will I fit? You will have fabulous, fantastic skills. You've just almost got to rethink about how you're going to use them. And look, I was that woman. I left full-time work to go to part-time work for about 5 years. I ran my own business, etc. And then, exactly as you're saying, I think my eldest got to high school, and I thought, okay, I'm ready. I'm going to go back in. There was no way I was going back to journalism. Journalism had completely changed during that period. Talking exactly what I was saying, I couldn't slot back into journalism. And what I did, and this is what I advise everyone, I went and talked to every single person I knew. And I said, these are my skills. I'm looking for a job. What do you think? And that is the power of creating the network effectively. And it was through those conversations, probably took about a year. I was able to, I ended up working at the Property Industry Foundation at the end of those conversations. So I sort of say to people who've taken a break from the workplace wants you. I'm sure Anastasia will attest to that. The workplace is desperate for you, to be honest with you. They're desperate for skilled people, but you're not who you were, and the job market is not what it was. That doesn't mean that you can't have a really fantastic career with the skills that you have.
And when you step in, because you're that much more mature and wise, and you still do have that original career experience, you'll accelerate fast. You really can accelerate fast, but you just got to adapt back in for a little bit.
And perhaps before we're getting close to time, so maybe just some advice that you could share to women who are just starting out, so really early in their career, who are coming out of university, probably haven't ventured down the parenthood route yet. They're just starting their career. Any advice for people early in their career?
My advice would be, you're often, going into a partnership, and you may marry or just have a lifelong partnership with someone. And when you are both young, you have equal prospects on your career, you have equal ambition and aspirations for each other's career. And it's just easy. You don't even talk about that other than the things you're aiming for. But I don't think you have conscious conversations around when you will have a family and how that may play out, and the fact that you are consciously supporting each other's career. I think if men go into the relationship knowing that when they have children, they are going to equally share, it is the best enabler for their partner to stay in the workforce and progress their career. You got to be conscious about it.
Good advice.
I would add to that, just to remember that your career, like your partnership, like your life, it's going to be long. You know, it does go through, it doesn't progress the way you think it will, in my experience. It does go through peaks and troughs. You know, we want flexibility at work, but you as an employee, as a worker, as a participant, you also have to be flexible. You know, you have to understand that we have to kind of realize that your career may take different directions that perhaps you hadn't foreseen, and sometimes that leads to the most exciting of places.
Yes, really good advice. And actually, I would add to that one, an extension of what you're saying, Kate, is your journey is long. I do think that there is, and I don't know if this is a fair way to describe it, but there is a lot of youthful impatience that I observe around, you know, what's next, what's next, what's next. And I know when I was at school, you know, we were told we're going to change our career, you know, 2 or 3 times. And I think that stat's now much bigger. I think children at school get told they're going to change their career a dozen times or something extraordinary. But yes, I think there is, knowing that the career does go for a long time and all sorts of opportunities are going to present themselves that you have not planned for, and to be open to those and fluid in terms of where you want to go is really wonderful advice. One last question that's come through. Thanks for the insights on parenthood and pushing for change. As a 30-year-old, I'm smack bang in the do I start a family? What's the effect on my career? And what else is there besides asking my partner to contribute to my super? Okay, so this person's in the thick of trying to make a whole lot of decisions about a whole lot of things. Hopefully we've given this person lots of advice, but any last gems you want to pass across?
Well, I have to show my own bias here. I mean, I have 2 children, so I always advise people to have children, but that's my bias. I get that. It doesn't work. It's not necessary for everyone. Look, I think just broadly, and it comes back to what we were saying before, you know, life is holistic. You know, it's not all about career. It's about your health. It's about your partnership. It's about your friendships. It's about education. I mean, I took time out of my career to do another master's. You know, like it's not a thin, long path. It's quite a wide, thick, and hopefully juicy path.
What I would say is, when you're 80, you're not going to remember the role that you're in now at 30 and what you were giving up, and you are going to totally remember your legacy of your children and your hopefully grandchildren and great grandchildren, and go for it as quickly as you can, because life's too short.
Wonderful. All right. So perhaps before we do our final wrap, ladies, takeaway or your personal commitment to break the bias. What's your 2022 International Women's Day commitment or call to action going to be?
I'll go first.
Okay.
Mine would be break the bias by leading the change and encouraging embracement of the change.
Gosh, well, look, mine would be the break the bias. It's one thing I always say here, and I honestly do believe it. Getting more women to the top is great, but actually getting more women off the bottom is better. You know, I'm a feminist. You know, I think on International Women's Day, I don't just think about this conversation. I think about women of all different shapes and sizes around the world. And the question to myself is, well, how do I connect this conversation and my daily practice to the situations that women are facing across the world around modern slavery, around domestic violence, etc.
Impressive, ladies. So impressive. So you've inspired lots of chatter, so I'm going to keep sharing what's coming through. I think people are sharing their own personal commitments to break the bias, calling all men to break the gender bias. So I think that's come from one of our other male audience members. So that's fantastic. And so I'm just going to scroll through the comments because I think there's a few more here about ensuring that they're going to challenge their own personal bias more by deliberately asking for feedback from their team. So before they're making decisions, making sure they're being consultative and asking for feedback from their team. Oh, and bravo, impressive. So well done, ladies. You've definitely inspired the audience. So look, thank you both so much for being part of this discussion. I have enjoyed it thoroughly. You're definitely an inspiration. For those people who are on the audience, if we've mentioned any articles, if Kate or Anastasia have talked about any research or things we've read, we will dig that up and make sure that we are sharing that with all of you. We've definitely enjoyed the conversation. We hope that we've given you some inspiration. I think this is a journey that we are well and truly on, and great progress is being made, but we know it's one that we need to keep the conversation going. We need to continue to be brave and be bold. and hopefully we will continue to forge that through with some future Comm.unity Space&Co events. So stay tuned. We have another one coming up soon, which will be a nice complement to this one, most likely around Men's Health Week. So we look forward to bringing some great new speakers to that one. So thank you, everyone, and goodbye.
Thank you, Shey.
Thanks for having us.